Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects. This is the initial presentation in the Trust's inaugural lecture series. It is the first of a four-part series focusing on the extraordinary work and continuing influence of the 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. The series will be followed by future presentations that examine the work of other specific architects, as well as a range of topics relating to architecture and design. Today's lecture, entitled Andrea Palladio, Still the Eternal Contemporary, will explore Palladio's work in its context. It will be followed by programs focusing on his influence on architecture in Britain and Ireland, his impact on American architecture, and finally, his continuing influence and relevance to architecture going forward. The series is presented in conjunction with the RIBA's Palladio project. This initial lecture will be presented by Dr. Guido Beltramini, director of the Chiesa Palladio in Vicenza. Dr. Beltramini will be introduced by Charles Hind, chief curator of the British Architectural Library at the RIBA, who will also serve as interlocutor for the program. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Charles Hind.
Hello, everyone, wherever and in whatever time zone you are. As Ted Gamble has said, this is the first of four lectures given by distinguished scholars and an architect on Palladio, on Anglo-Palladianism in England and North America, and the relevance of one particular Italian Renaissance architect to the current architectural profession. The reason for the lectures is the planned publication in the next couple of years by the Royal Institute of British Architects of a catalogue of all the drawings by Andrea Palladio in British collections. There are over 380 of them, that is 86% of the surviving total, of which 356 are in the collection of the British Architectural Library of the RIBA. They arrived in England in two groups. The first brought back in 1614 by Inigo Jones and Henry Howard, Earl of Arundel, and the second in 1719 by Richard Boyle, Earl of Burlington, who subsequently acquired most of the earlier group. For nearly 150 years, these drawings were accessible to successive generations of English architects and formed the basis of what later came to be known as Anglo-Palladianism, the style that dominated English and American architectural practice for centuries. The collection of drawings is remarkable as its quantity more or less equals those autograph, as opposed to studio drawings, for all other Italian Renaissance architects put together, whilst the sketches and doodles that survive for no other of Palladio's contemporaries give unique access to his thought processes. Our speaker today, Dr. Guido Beltramini, is writing the catalogue of these drawings with contributions by Professor Pierre Gros in Paris and RIBA colleagues. During and after a long programme of conservation, they have been subjected to unprecedented intellectual, scientific, and historical analysis. Much new information has come to light, as we shall hear. But first, we need to set Palladio in context. Over to you, Guido.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you to everybody for the invitation. And I like to start with sharing my screen. Fantastic. Okay. So this is the face of our hero, Andrea Palladio. This is the one of the only two certified portraits of Palladio from the 16th century. And this portrait was discovered by an art dealer in a flea market in New Jersey in 2009, very recently, 11 years ago. Who is Palladio? Palladio was born in a small region at the northeast of Italy and in the state of Venice, a republic, the only republic in Italy of that time, and with territories around Venice, but also in Istria and also in Greece. Palladio was born in 1508, was born in Padua, and his father has a small flour milling business. In 1521, Palladio joins as a workshop as a stone cutter. This is very important for Palladio because Palladio begins doing manual works. And this is very important for all his career. In 1524, Palladio moved from Padua to Vicenza and met Gian Giorgio Trissino. Gian Giorgio Trissino was Palladio's mentor, extremely important for him because Trissino invents the name Palladio, because the name of Palladio was Andrea, son of Peter, and Trissino invented for him this classical name, Palladio. And the most important thing probably is that Trissino takes Palladio to Rome. And you can imagine the impression on the young architect. The ruins like these are the baths of Caracalla in Rome that Palladio visited in 1541 with Gian Giorgio Trissino. The impact of the Roman ruins on the young architect Palladio was immense, and Palladio creates on the basis a real spatial revolution. Villa Pisani al Bagnolo, for example, a majestic room with brick vaults derived from the ancient Roman bath. 1549 is a key date for Palladio because started the building site of the Basilica Palladiana, his masterpiece probably in Vicenza. But 1 year later, also starts the building site of Palazzo Chiericati. And with thanks to these buildings, Palladio fame reaches beyond Vicenza, and the great Venetian families discover this young architect and asked him to create the large complexes that we now call the villas, the Palladio villas, a new type of building in which the house of the owner in the center is surrounded by other buildings for agricultural purposes. In 1559, Palladio started to work in the city of Venice, very unusual for a provincial architect like Palladio, but Palladio had very powerful sponsors, and from the Romanist, so-called Romanist families, loyal to Rome and the Pope. And so the majority of the Palladio commissions in Venice are monasteries and churches, like the Church of San Giorgio here, or the Convent of the Carità and the Church of the Redentore. In 1570, Palladio published the Quattro Libri, the result of 30 years' work. And this is maybe the most important project of the entire Palladio career, because Palladio was the first architect who understood how important was a new medium, the print, to communicate his own work. In the 70s, Palladio permanently lived in Venice. He published an illustrated edition of Julius Caesar's Commentaries. It's a very interesting book about the battles between the Roman and the Gauls, and also another book on the Polybius wars between Carthaginians and Romans. In 1580, Palladio died. His last work is the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. where Palladio reconstructs the theater of the ancient Romans, exactly as Vitruvio writes and Palladio himself measures the ruins of the Roman theater to recreate this important type of building for the Romans. Some clues if you are interested in Palladio. The key books are, first, the 4 books on architecture, translated very well by Robert Taverner and Richard Schofield in a very good edition by the MIT Press, published in 1997. James Ackerman Palladio is still the best book on Palladio, also if it's published in 1966, but it is today too, I think, the best way to meet Palladio and to enter in Palladio work and career. Very interesting, this book by a British geographer, Dennis Cosgrove, The Palladian Landscape. This is very interesting book because Cosgrove had a territorial view on the Palladio position of building, relation between the site and the environment. Very interesting book, I think, the most interesting book published in decades on Palladio. And last, if you are interested also in drawings, the 2 catalog of the 2 exhibitions we organized, Charles and I, in London in 2008, and in Washington, New York, and Pittsburgh in 2010. In these books, you can find a lot of information about drawings, about the materiality also of the Palladio's drawings. Why we are here today? In 1730, Lord Burlington, the famous Palladianist and collector of Palladian materials, published his Palladio drawings on the Roman bath. Here is the proud Burlington and the frontispiece of his book, Fabbriche Antiche. The Terme dei Romani, published by Burlington, was the first facsimile publication of architectural drawing ever. And Burlington asked to use a black sepia ink to make the print closer to the real aspect of the drawings. So not black ink, but sepia ink. And these are some pages of Burlington. And in the foreword to the readers, Burlington wrote, "These baths will be followed by a second volume of various drawings on arches, theater, temples, and other ancient buildings by the same author." And the Riba project that Charles presented is the realization of Burlington's dream after 3 centuries. And we work a lot on the Palladio drawings, and we examine in depth every single drawings in British collection when Palladio drawings are known to be kept in Worcester College Library in Oxford, in Chatsworth House Library in Derbyshire, Windsor Castle Library in Windsor, and Westminster Abbey Library in London. And we have discovered previously unknown Palladio drawings like this in Chatsworth, or this in Worcester College, or also this in Worcester College too. Very interesting, the plan probably of a Roman basilica. We processed all the Riba drawings and checked the attribution to Palladio on the basis not only of the drafting style, but also of the handwriting. And because in the Italian archives, we documented the handwriting of Palladio, of his son and his collaborators. You can see here how different are the singular handwriting. And so on the basis of this knowledge, we have confirmed or not confirmed the Palladio authorship. For instance, this was a famous drawings, a tribute to Palladio, but we saw there the handwriting of Scamozzi, so we understood that it was not by Palladio, but by Scamozzi. It was very important to examine it directly with our own eyes, all the drawings, because there are many elements not visible in photograph, like the scale rule of puncture marks, for instance, that Palladio used. And we also discover the subjects of many drawings. For instance, we discover a unpublished drawing, not unpublished, but unknown drawing for the Villa Malcontenta in Venice. We decoded the highly complex, yes, multi-subject sheets. For instance, a sheet like this are 23 different sketches by Palladio of low-cost housing, a plan of a big house, churches, a Roman theater, a contemporary theaters, and so on. And we work also a lot on the individual sketches. For instance, a sheet like this has a project for the City Hall in Brescia, but also the choir of the San Giorgio Church in Venice, 2 studies based on Raphael Palazzo Brancone in Rome, or a study on the Serlio Regole Generali. These are all the Palladio design drawings. We dated all of them. We discovered a lot on them. We have in red drawings for villas, in black drawings for palazzi, for city buildings. The difference is country building and city buildings. You can say here a lot of Palladio design for palazzi, or this is a fantastic sequence of 7 different drawings for the same villa. Not in British collections means that there are also in this sequence drawings that are in Italy or also in the US at Cornell University. We have 1 drawing by Palladio, or in Sweden or in Budapest. These are the drawings by Palladio for Palazzo Chiericati, Villa Chiericati in Bancimuglio. You can see how many drawings we have, and these are only the design drawings by Palladio. So not antique drawings from survey of the ruins and so on, and not the theoretical drawing. These are only the design drawings, project for plan of buildings, for elevation of churches like this, for plan and elevation of churches, or the big project for Palazzo Ducale in Venice. And the last drawing is the Teatro Olimpico, the drawing for Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. And all of these drawings are in the RRBA collection, and not in the British collections are this small group of drawings in Vicenza, in the Palladio museums, with the important project for the Rialto Bridge, for instance, in Venice. There are a very interesting group of drawings for the facade of the Basilica in San Petronio, and they are still now in the same place. We have one drawing from the CCA in Montreal, a facade of the Church of San Petronio, and from the State Archive of Venice, few drawings, and also from Brescia. So this is the complete survey of the Palladio drawings. Now we try to understand better what the Palladio drawings are for us. How we can manage this huge group of drawings? Okay, we can try to put together some drawings for their typology. For instance, some drawings are first ideas on paper. A drawing like this. This is one of the most important drawings in the Palladio collections because this is a sheet with Palladio reuse a sheet where he made a reconstruction of the temple of Mars Ultor in Rome, but he reused part of the sheet for study the plan of a house in Vicenza, maybe Palazzo Volpe. And it's very interesting because are 20 alternatives of the same plan. This here we can look at Palladio moving his idea of architecture as a language with some words, the 3 kind of rooms, 8 kind of stairs, some kind of columns, and Palladio put together all his elements with the syntax of the proportions and the relation between the parts. Also, these we have already seen are first ideas on paper. When the idea exit from the Palladio's brain and Palladio fixed it on paper. A second category of drawings are the studied drawings, when Palladio is developing the idea, and is a process that Palladio made for himself. So when he discovered the solution, he stopped, like in this drawing, where Palladio was studying the facade of a building, and when he understood that this facade can't work, he stops, and the drawing is not completely made. The presentation drawings, at the opposite, are final drawings. We can call today them renderings to convince the client, to convince the patron. And it's very interesting the way in which Palladio presents his designs. And within 2 alternatives, you can have the facade on the left, and different is the facade on the right. And I imagine that Palladio asked to the client, what do you think? What do you prefer? On the right, you can have more light in the big sala, but in the left, you have an entire attic plan on top of the building. Probably, what do you prefer? And also this is for the plan. These are 3 plans for the same building, Palazzo Barbarano, where Palladio say, okay, we can have a corridor here and a huge atrium in the center with vaults here, or we can have a square atrium here, then a loggia, a small courtyard, and another loggia, or we can have a bigger atrium here with a smaller courtyard. So we have to imagine Palladio discussing with his client about these different possibilities. Palladio was the first architect that understood how powerful was the new medium, the print, the books, to communicate his own work. So these are some of my favorite Palladio drawings. Is an attempt of Palladio to publish elevation and plan together to save space in his publication, because this is his idea. On the right, you have the temple of Assisi, and in this sheet, Palladio is trying to put together plan and elevation, but in the publication, he prefers to dedicate 1 page for the elevation and the other page for the plan, because it was more legible. And the same is here. for a small Corinthian temple, probably a temple of Pola. And also here, Palladio, at the end, prefer to use two pages and not to try to compress the image only in one page. But this is fantastic drawing, I think. And also in the final drawings, he has this idea to publish half of the facade and half of the courtyard to save space. Another category between the Palladio building and the survey drawings. When Palladio walked inside the ancient buildings, taking measurements, a sheet like this is a nightmare to study it, but is so magnificent to look at, because it's Palladio walking into the ruins of two famous complexes, the Bath of Caracalla and Bath of Diocletian. And it's difficult to understand this drawing because I use some colors. This is my rendering to make more evident the different part of the drawing, of the Palladio drawing. This is the original one, and this is my proposal. And the red one are, as you can see here, the yellow one, excuse me, part of the Bath of Diocletian in Rome. And you see that the yellow one is the general view of this part. And then these and these are two different zoom of this area of the drawing where Palladio make design bigger and more bigger here he study better this. And the same, this is part of the Bath of Caracalla, where the red one is where Palladio is studying the general plan, and the violet here, where Palladio tried to recreate the whole main part of the building. It's interesting because for Palladio, the Roman buildings are not a dead language, but are living language, are living building. So in drawings like this, Palladio is reinventing the building on the basis of very few tracks on the ground. These are the complex of the Bath of Agrippa, and Palladio, there are very, very few, very small ruins, very few remains of the complex. So Palladio had to reinvent, to redesign also the elevation here. And after this, he created the rendering of this. So this is the study, and this is the final drawing on the basis of his. This is one of the magnificent drawings that Lord Burlington published. This is the original, because Lord Burlington found these drawings in Mazères during his trip to Italy, and so he published his trophy like this, or this fantastic plan of the Bath of Diocletian, with also the elevation of the architectural details. How much time Palladio spent in studying the ancient ruins and in redesign these. How can we attribute a drawing to Palladio? We are lucky because we have a lot of documents written by Palladio in some legal causes, and this is a receipt by Palladio for his honorarium for the June 1564. I, Andrea Palladio, received from the Marco Trissino, the Count Marco Trissino, Hungary 5. Hungary is his stipendium for the month of June. So on the basis of this, we can compare the handwriting of Palladio with the inscriptions on the drawings. And in this case, is very clear. On the top, you have a detail of a drawing by Palladio for the Bath of Caracalla. And you can say how peculiar, idiosyncratic are the letter E, cornise here and here, and also the letter A in this way, and also the letter S. Can you see like a hook here and here? And also we are lucky because Palladio changes his handwriting during the time. Because when Palladio was young, he writes the letter E like a Greek epsilon, this. And after 1550, he changes the way to design the letter E and write it in this way. So Palladio after 1550 is tempio, temple, la E is this, and before 1550 in this way. So this is very useful for us to date the drawing. For instance, in a drawing like this, we have an inscription here, alto sotto il volto palmi. This is the height of the temple under the vault. You can see here the epsilon handwriting. In fact, is a copy by Palladio of a drawing by another architect, Piero Ligorio. But can you see here, there is another inscription, and the letter E is made in another way, this way, different from this epsilon way. Why? What happened? Palladio is doing again the drawing, adding information, because Palladio was creating the drawing for the page of the 4 books on architecture. So Palladio added some measurements with his mature handwriting on his drawing made before the 1550. The techniques of the Palladio drawings are Palladio used to incise the construction lines, we can see here, with an ivory stylus. It's important, the ivory, because if you use a steel or iron stylus, you probably cut the fibers of the paper. But if you use an ivory stylus, you can create all this construction line. It's very useful, this study drawings interrupted, because we can see the process of Palladio first design these lines and then to draws on them with the pen. When Palladio made a survey, like for these drawings for the Bath of Caracalla, he first, when he was into the ruins, he preferred to use the red chalk and not the ink. And so he designed the plan inside the ruins, takes some measurements, and later he redraws with a pen. The red chalk is, you must know that the graphite was, so the modern pencils, the graphite was discovered in Germany only in the end of the 16th century. So a soft element to design are the red chalk and the black chalk. This is red chalk, and otherwise you have to use a pen like this in this portrait of the famous architect Giuliano da Sangallo. And it's very interesting, the description by Scamozzi, the pens are made of flexible, light color, transparent, domestic goose feathers. And so before the red chalk invented by Leonardo and Bramante, the architect used only pen and ink. But here we can see a drawing by Palladio. Palladio drew this with a pen, but then he made some correction in black chalk. The last elements very important for us to understand Palladio are the conventions. Palladio grew up like a stonemason. And the work of a stonemason is to start from a template like this and to carving a piece of stone using this element to create an element like this. So for Palladio, the drawing is not an image, is always a tool to measure and to create something. For this reason, the majority, the 98% of the Palladio drawings are in orthogonal projections and are all to scale. A drawings like this is the facade of Villa Repeta Campiglia, close to Vicenza. And you can see that the villa is on orthogonal projections. And you have here the scale in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet, another 5, so in 10 feet, and are extremely important also for the way in which Palladio think about architecture. Because if we look at the most famous facade of a church by Palladio, the Church of the Redentore, it's clear that the source for the Church of the Redentore is the Pantheon in Rome, but not the real Pantheon with his projecting portico like this, but the survey drawing of the Pantheon in orthogonal projection. So the way of Palladio to design in orthogonal projection is something that help us to understand why this 3D object is the source for this. And also, this is the temple of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Assisi. These are freestanding columns. And it's clear that Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza, its source is the huge columns of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. But why these are pillars and these are columns? Because the source for Palladio is not the building himself, but the drawing that Palladio made of the building. You have to remember that Palladio lived very far from Rome. So he went to Rome, he took a lot of drawings, and then came back to Vicenza. But in Vicenza, the Roman buildings are their representation in the drawings. So for this reason, the Palladio drawings are so important, because Palladio made his invention on the basis of his drawings. Thank you very much for this, for your patience.
Thank you, Guido. One of the points that, one of the attractions, I should say, of Palladio is that although we don't know a huge amount about his biography, he comes over where we, either what we do know or what we can work out from his clients, that he was extraordinarily sort of humane man, and one who, for the first time amongst Italian Renaissance architects, was keen to make architecture accessible to everybody. The idea was, to his contemporaries, that architecture was, you applied to a church or to a palace, a very grand building, and Palladio felt that architecture could be applied just as much to a barn, or, as you've shown us, to low-cost housing. And I doubt whether any of his esteemed contemporaries ever considered how the poor might live, or might live in better conditions. Do you think this is partly because, or wholly perhaps, because his background was so different from those of his contemporaries. He came to it through the building crafts, or as a stonemason, rather than coming to it like his contemporaries through painting and sculpture.
This is a very interesting question, Charles, and I think is very the Palladio is different from the other architect, because I think that there are also today two kinds of architects. The problem-solving architect, in the sense, please give me a budget, a site, a client, and I give you a building. But there are other architects like Palladio, Le Corbusier, or Leon Battista Alberti that wanted to change the world, to make the world better. And if you think, all of these three architects wrote a handbook to change the world, because the Re Edificatoria by Leon Battista Alberti, the 4 books of architecture by Palladio, and the Modular of Le Corbusier are books where these three architects tried to give us rules, methods, and ways to make the world around us better. And for Palladio, it is extremely important, I think, to create houses safe, not too expensive, common low-cost houses. You know that Palladio uses always low-cost materials. Palladio prefers not to use the precious stone as all the other architects did in that moment, but he prefers to use bricks. And Palladio created really a new kind of plaster where you put some marble powder or stone powder in the plaster, and working it with a hot iron, you recreate the aspect of the stone. So you made a fake stone. And for instance, it is surprising, but all the architraves of the Villa Rotonda in Vicenza or in Villa Emo are in wood, covered by this plaster invented by Palladio. The Marmorino plaster is the name. And I remember how I was surprised when I visited the Thomas Jefferson's building in Virginia, in the US, how close Jefferson was with the real Palladio materials, cioè wood, bricks, and this the plaster called so-called Marmorino plaster. So also another key element for Palladio is the relation with us and the environment around us. The villas of Palladio are buildings with a very well done relation with the site, with the rivers, with the position of the building in relation with roads, not only with the rivers. So Palladio was not an architect of prince and kings. Palladio worked in the Republic of Venice. And in a republic, you don't have a prince with the big house, but is a republic means that all the nobles of the Palladio patrons are the same. And so this is the reason for which Palladio made so many houses of the same type. Very few extremely rich houses, and more simple houses in the countryside or in the city. And I think that this is, regarding your question, Charles, the Palladio's background in the building side is very important for Palladio because he is really inside the architecture, inside the way in which we can build something. And for instance, probably Palladio preferred to use stone to make columns, but was impossible because stone columns are too expensive for the Venetian private patrons. So he invented the marmorino plaster, but this is because Palladio grew up in the building site, so he knew exactly how to build. He knew exactly not only the theory of architecture, but also the practice of architecture. And this, I think, was very rare in Palladio's time because the other architects like Raphael was a painter, Bramante was a painter, Michelangelo was a sculptor and painter. Only Antonio da Sangallo, the famous Roman architect, was like Palladio, coming from a building site. And so this is, I think, the secret ingredient of the Palladio formation, of the Palladio education. The site, the how to build, and the library of Gian Giorgio Trissino. So the culture and the brick. The book and the brick are the two elements in the Palladio life.
I've always liked the practical approach he takes to the language of classicism, because obviously it goes back to Vitruvius as the only surviving treatise on architecture. And of course, Vitruvius is slightly difficult to interpret, but he tries to come up with a code of what his followers tended to regard as rules, things that you must follow. Whereas Palladio's own view was, well, the rules are there, but you can break them creatively if the result will be a good one. So you can mix up the orders if you think the result will be good. And for example, I'm just thinking about this humble aspect of his work. With the Tuscan order, he said, well, you can make the gaps between the columns wider when you've got a farm building because you need to get a farm wagon through, and the canonical rules wouldn't allow you. So fine, it's a practical solution to a problem that still provides a satisfying visual result. And I feel that I've always felt that this is the side of Palladio which I find particularly endearing. He's not hung up on too much on rules and how things should look. He breaks the rules if he thinks the results justify them, and pretty much they always do.
Absolutely, Charles. And this is the reason for which it's important to visit the Palladio building, not only to study Palladio through the 4 books of architecture, because in the 4 books, Palladio gave the rules. But in the buildings, as you said, he broke the rules, because in many cases, when the situation needs a change of the rules, Palladio doesn't have any problem to change it. And for instance, I was looking at the Basilica Palladiana, the huge, the first very important building that Palladio built. There is a correspondence between the half Doric capitals of the Serliana and from the Doric capital of the Serliana and the half Doric capital of the pillar close the Serliana. But if we look what Palladio did in the Ionic order, Palladio understood that to put only half Ionic capitals make a silly solution. So he created an abstract capital in relation with the Ionic. This is completely breaking any rules. And I remember that when I started studying Palladio, there are still some scholars that say, no, Palladio never did this. But it's not true. Palladio did. Palladio defined the rules, but also, I recently studied the cornice of the Palladio buildings. Is the elements, the boundary between the sky and the building. It's very, very delicate part of the building. And in the 4 books of architecture, Palladio say, when we use the Doric, we have to use this cornice. When you use the Ionic, this. When we use the Corinthian or composite, these and this. If we look at the drawings, at the buildings, it's completely different, because the cornice is very, very far from us. Also, if on top of a Ionic order, Palladio preferred not to use the Ionic cornice because it's too sophisticated, too well carved, and he preferred to use a composite cornice because is less defined, more strong, and so in the distance works better. So he constantly breaks the rules he himself gave to us. And if we want, there are two bodies. There is this fantastic theory in the medieval about the 2 bodies of the king. There is the real body of the king and the theoretical body of the king. Okay. Also in Palladio, we have the 2 bodies of the king of architecture. We have the 4 books of architecture, and we have the buildings. And we have to appreciate the 4 books, but also to look at the building to understand how economy, how occasion are used by Palladio to change, to adapt, more than sometimes break, but more adapt the rules to the different situations.
I think that it's always amusing sometimes that English architects who went to Italy, most of them of course didn't, they relied on the 4 books and subsequent editions of the 4 books for their understanding of Palladio, but the ones who did actually go to the Veneto and look at Palladio's buildings were almost invariably disappointed. They didn't measure up to their expectations because, using your analogy, they were looking at the sort of holy body, and that was what they expected when they got there, and they found the very real human body of Palladio, the reality of Palladio's buildings. And I wonder, I mean, Jefferson famously went to northern Italy, but never quite got to Vicenza, so he never actually saw, if I think I'm right, did he actually see a building by Palladio? I wonder whether somebody said to him, don't go, don't bother, you'll be terribly disappointed. So just
maybe. But I was a young student, and I went with James Sterling, the British architect, and Manfredo Tafuri, my teacher at the university, to visit some Palladio buildings. And I remember how disappointed was James Sterling, saying, oh, but are not in stone. This is bricks covered by plaster. And so he was so disappointed by these fake materials of Palladio. So you are absolutely true.
And this brings me on to something that I think will always intrigue me, that given how many architects you encounter in your work as director of the Centro, and obviously the Centro Palladio deals with contemporary architectural matters as well as historic ones, but many of those contemporary architects are not remotely interested in architectural history. So what is it about Palladio that you think justifies us calling Palladio the eternal contemporary?
But the reason is because Palladio is really at the origin of architectural practice. Palladio was at the beginning of the revolution of architectural practice, started in the beginning of the 16th century, when they reinvent the language of architecture, and they reinvent also the way in which we have to design architecture using section, plan, elevation. And Palladio was there. And Palladio's drawings are the best example of this new vision about building after the Middle Ages. The other question, I think, is that what I feel is that the present changes so fast in front of our eyes that I think that we need a distant point to look at the present, but not to be overwhelmed by the present. And I think that history is a good way to look at some topics important for us today, but looking at the origin of these topics. And for instance, Charles, how important is communication today for the architects? Publication, to publish your work. Well, the first man that start to think of what is the best way to publish my work is Palladio, because Sebastiano Serlio published his books decades before Palladio, but Serlio didn't publish his own projects. And Palladio was the first architect that had the problem. How? Because it's clear, Palladio was born in the province, far from Rome, far from Florence, far from the art cities of the 16th century, far from Paris, London, and Madrid. So if you are the architect of the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, everybody knows who you are. But if you design villas in the Veneto countryside, nobody knows about you. And so Palladio said, okay, but how can I make my work well known? Using the book, this new medium invented in Venice 50 years before. And Palladio was the first architect that used a book, but not only to communicate his own projects, because you know that the 4 books of architecture is a masterpiece of publishing architecture, because the first book is a handbook for architects, how I design the orders, how to make a wall, foundations, and so on, the stairs. The 3rd and the 4th book are about the most beautiful Roman buildings. So if you live in Scotland and you are interested in the Pantheon, in the 4 books of architecture, you have the best drawings of the Pantheon you can have. And inside this manual for architects, Palladio put his own project in a sort of example of the okay, I give you the rules of the Roman buildings, and now I show you some sample of my work. But when Palladio published his own projects, maybe some projects like Palladio published the 4 books on architecture in 1570. And Palazzo Chiericati was designed by Palladio in 1550, 20 years later, 20 years before, and the same 30 years Palazzo Thiene. And when Palladio published Palazzo Thiene, for instance, he didn't publish exactly the Palazzo Thiene as built. But he changed a little bit the project, solve some problems, make the Palazzo Thiene in the 4 books is different from the Palazzo Thiene in the streets of Vicenza, because Palladio changed some elements. And in that certain sense, Palladio redesigned the building for publication. This, I think, is so modern, so interesting. The use in which Palladio used the book to communicate his own idea, his own project. And this is, Palladio is important for today because he is at the origin of a lot of problems and questions and topics interesting for us today.
We're about to run into, we're running up against the clock, so I have to ask if your reply can be fairly quick. But one thing we haven't really tackled is proportion. And I'm very aware when I take groups around buildings by Palladio, how responsive people are to them, people who don't know the details of the orders and such like, but they always respond to Palladio's buildings, I think, because of the proportional system that he used and adapted. And proportions are something that is inherent in nature, Fibonacci numbers and so on. And I just wonder sometimes whether Palladio has tapped something that, although he's obviously of his time, but something that will resonate down the ages. And that is the natural human response to good proportions. What are your views on that?
Yeah. I think that Palladio, the idea of Palladio was that he was searching for the algorithm of architecture in the Roman buildings. So we have in your collection, Charles, you have dozens of design by Palladio of specific detail of entablature, of capitals, and this is that for Palladio, numbers are the key of the success of a good architecture. And I am very impressed of in this Palladio is like a magician sometimes, because if you try to take a picture of a Palladio building, you look at the building in front of you and say, okay, you take your camera and you say, oh, you must go backward for a lot of time, because the quality of the Palladio spaces they are monumental, but through proportions, they are so human-based. So you feel yourself comfortable in the spaces. But if you try to take some measurements, you see they are huge spaces. But Palladio was able to find the right proportion, the right relation between us and the space. There is a very important article written by Deborah Howard, a British scholar, and his husband, Malcolm Longhair, about proportion on Palladio. You can easily find Palladio proportion and Deborah Howard. Is easy to find their article. And I think, and also the Branko Mitrovic book, a book like Learning from Palladio is about this also. So I think that is extremely important. The proportions are the key element in Palladio architecture, and the practice of measure Palladio buildings is so important also for us today. I am so happy when I see young architects in Vicenza taking measurements from the Palladio buildings, because it's the best way to enter in Palladio world, measure and understanding the measurements.
Well, thank you for providing us and us all with your particular entrance into Palladio's mind and work. We've overrun by 5 minutes. I hope we'll be forgiven for that, but thank you, Guido, very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Charles.